By the time he turned 21, Baltimore already whispered his name in fear. They said he was the city's most dangerous shooter, responsible for nearly 20 bodies, running a crew hundreds deep and pulling in money most adults never see in a lifetime. But this wasn't a crime story that started with power. It started with poverty, neglect, and a city that looked the other way. Montana Malik Barnett was born in 1995, right here in the richest country on earth. But from his very first breath, life was already leaning against him. Not because of something he did, but because of who he was and where he landed. A young black boy in America statistically starts life with fewer chances to make it to adulthood, stay out of prison, or reach what people like to call normal success like college, a career, and stability, and the numbers don't lie. If Montana didn't finish high school, his chances of having a full-time job by 30 were less than a coin flip. Meanwhile, a white kid in the same situation had close to a 90% chance. Even if Montana did everything right, stayed in school, earned a degree, played by the rules, he was still looking at making about 20% less than a white man doing the same job. And poverty, that trap was stickier too. A white child born into poverty was 3 times more likely to climb out than a black child born into the same struggle. Now stack that on top of where Montana grew up, Sandtown, West Baltimore, a place the whole world learned about through The Wire. But long before the cameras showed up, the streets were already telling that story. Drug corners everywhere. Violence so normal, it barely made people flinch. Back in the early 90s, scholars were already calling it one of the poorest, most unemployed, most crime-heavy areas in the city. Mostly black, mostly struggling, mostly forgotten. But stats aren't destiny. Most kids in places like Sandtown don't turn into criminals. A lot of them beat the odds through strong families, good mentors, real opportunities, and support. They find a way out. The problem is, not everybody gets those things. Baltimore's former mayor once said that in almost every high school classroom in the city, there's one kid who ends up getting swallowed by the streets. In a big school, that turns into a lot of lost kids. Montana was one of the ones who didn't get a cushion. He was born into poverty and raised around dysfunction. His father was deported back to Jamaica. His mother wasn't really present. The adults in his world weren't building anything. They were surviving, numbing, hustling, or disappearing. The family business wasn't a shop or a trade. It was drugs. Even his house was working against him. A rundown row home on Harlem Avenue, filled with lead paint, something that silently damages kids' brains and behavior over time. A whole generation grew up poisoned without anyone ever calling it what it was. School didn't save him either. Harlem Park Elementary was known as one of the worst performing schools in the state. And by the time Montana was old enough to think about work, the legal jobs paid next to nothing and demanded way more than they gave back. So the streets made their pitch. On one side, minimum wage, stress, and still being broke. On the other side, fast money, status, and survival. The corners didn't just sell drugs. They sold a sense of control in a world where Montana had none. He started as the baby on the block, running errands, carrying things, watching, learning. The older guys even joked about him because he used to like the police. That didn't last. Adults would sometimes stop him and his siblings late at night and ask who they belonged to, what they were doing out alone. But nobody stayed long enough to change the direction he was headed. By 9 years old, Montana wasn't just around the streets, he was part of them. He was arrested for stealing a car before he even hit double digits. That mugshot tells the whole story. A skinny little boy, big eyes, fear written all over his face, 65 pounds, barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel, looking more confused than dangerous. And by then, the streets already had him. By this point, Montana was working for a local heroin dealer named Davon Robinson, helping move a brand they called Get Right. And this wasn't some sloppy street hustle. It was organized, layered, and built to make money fast. Inside these small stash houses and backroom setups, the raw heroin would get chopped down with whatever white powder was around. Quinine, caffeine, chalk, baking soda, crushed pills, even a baby laxative people called Bonita. The point wasn't quality, it was quantity. Stretch the product, multiply the profit, then they'd scoop the mix into gel caps, count them out in bundles of 25 or 50, and ship them to the corners. The way the whole thing ran was like a system. The corner man stood out front. They flagged cars, took orders, handled cash, but they never touched the drugs. The runners moved the message, sale made, signal sent, and the hitters did the handoff. They went to the stash spot, usually some abandoned house nearby, grabbed the caps, and delivered them to the buyer. That last part was the riskiest, so they gave it to the youngest kids. If they got caught, the charges stayed lighter. That was the logic. Montana and his half-brother Terrell both started as hitters, but they weren't slow and they weren't lazy. They learned fast, worked hard, and before long, they weren't just working the system, they were running one. They started pushing their own product under the same name, Get Right. Davon wasn't feeling that at all, so the brothers switched the name to True Bomb and kept moving. And it wasn't just heroin anymore. It was fentanyl, coke, weed, pills, perks, Xanax, whatever people wanted, they had it, and the money came quick. Soon, everybody in the neighborhood knew Tana and Rel, familiar faces, dangerous ones too. They weren't just kids anymore. They were official players in the game. And the game had its own rules, its own look, its own language, its own soundtrack. It also had one promise it always kept. Nobody made it out clean. That danger was part of the appeal. Out there, respect came from fear. Territory was defended with guns that were way too easy to get. Life felt cheap. Death felt normal. People like to think kids choose that life because they want to rebel. That wasn't Tana. He wasn't pushing against anything. He was just stepping into what he grew up inside of. Kids adapt, they copy what they see. For him, violence was the baseline. It started in the house with beatings from an overwhelmed grandmother, then the bullying on the block, then the sound of gunshots at night. In Sandtown, kids learned to duck before they learned to dream. Seeing blood on the sidewalk wasn't shocking. That metallic smell, someone laid out on the pavement, that wasn't a tragedy, it was a Tuesday. When you grow up watching people die young, you stop planning for old age. The future feels fake. Tomorrow isn't promised, so you live for right now. That's not recklessness, that's survival. But Tana didn't just blend into the streets. He rose inside them. He had that natural pull, that way of talking where people listened without him having to force it. And he used that. Alongside his half-brother Rel, he stepped into leadership and helped build a crew called Train to Go, or TTG. At their peak, TTG ran like a machine. Drug money flowed in heavy, around $50,000 a week just from corner sales. They weren't hiding either. They were bold with it, flashing money, dropping slick videos, turning the street life into a brand. By the time Tana was barely 20, the city already had a name for him that carried real fear. He was known as the top trigger puller in Baltimore. And in a city where the murder rate sat miles above the national average, that wasn't a nickname, that was a warning. On the surface, the members of TTG weren't monsters. They were kids, regular teenagers who just happened to grow up in an environment that bent everything sideways. But that environment pushed them past normal limits. They became suspects in multiple killings, not accidents, not heat of the moment fights. These were targeted acts, silencing people, settling scores, clearing competition. For a long time in Baltimore, getting arrested didn't mean much to a dealer. You'd catch a charge, sit down for a bit, then come right back out and pick up where you left off. The system felt like a revolving door, But TTG changed that. Once murder became part of how they handled business, the authorities realized they couldn't treat this like regular street crime anymore. This wasn't just dealing, this was organized violence. So from around 2010 through 2017, Tana and Rel ran TTG straight out of Sandtown. They sat at the top with their inner circle, directing the flow of drugs, money, and muscle. Over those 7 years, they pushed heavy amounts of heroin, cocaine, weed, and whatever else the streets wanted. The operation stretched wide and moved fast, but the drugs were only half the story. TTG built its reputation on violence. Guns were tools, not threats. Members carried out assaults, kidnappings, and killings like assignments. Their name got so feared that other crews started reaching out to them not to beef, but to hire them. Groups like YGG didn't want war, they wanted services. They called TTG when they needed somebody gone. And that's when it became clear, TTG wasn't just another street crew. It had turned into a business where violence itself was the product. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in May 2013, and West Lafayette Avenue felt alive in a way it usually didn't. Folks were outside heavy that day, sitting on their stoops, leaning on railings, talking loud, laughing loud, just soaking up the sun on that slanted row house block. In front of one of those 3-story brick houses, painted that deep rust red with a clean marble stoop, sat 2 sisters, Alice Bridges and her half-sister, Leandra Williams. They were still pretty new to Sandtown. Just them, their mom, and their brother had moved in not long before, so they were still getting the feel of the block. Their brother, Alfonso, was 23. Everybody called him Twin. Big dude, thick build, round face, always smiling, always moving, always singing off key and dancing like he was on stage somewhere. That was just him. Always light, always playful, always in a good mood. He had been out of state for a while, but he had just come back home. His ex had just had his son, and he wanted to be around. He wanted to really be there for his kid. That afternoon, he had just gotten off his shift at the barbershop. Like he always did, he gathered up all the little kids on the block and walked them up to the corner store called Everything Cheap so they could load up on candy. After that, he kicked it for a minute with his boy Gotti on the corner. They linked up with a skinny teenage dealer to grab some Percocets. Then Twin headed back to the house. He posted up on the front steps with a cigarette and a cold beer. Music floated through the air. The whole block was buzzing because everybody was waiting on that big Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao fight later that night. One of the neighbors was hosting a watch party and everybody was pitching in. The energy was light. It felt like a good day. Alice and Leandra were outside too, still trying to get familiar with the neighbors. They had dressed to be seen. Alice had on a low-cut top. Leandra was in a tight dress that hugged everything just right. That's when a teenage dealer working the block noticed them. He came strolling down the sidewalk toward them. Small frame, athletic build, heavy sleepy eyes, gold fronts flashing when he smiled. And he wasn't smiling nice. He was smiling greedy. He came right up on them talking reckless, acting like he could just pick them up like items off a shelf. Depending on who told it, either he tried to claim both of them or he tried to tell Leandra to cover up her legs. Either way, the sisters weren't going for it. They snapped back. Leandra told him straight up to stop selling pills in front of their house. The kid didn't like that. His pride got touched. He pushed back, saying he could do whatever he wanted. That's when Twin stood up. And when Twin stood up, everything shifted. He towered over the teenager and shut it all the way down. He let him know real clear that he wasn't about to talk to his sisters crazy and he wasn't about to disrespect them like that. The kid immediately softened. He backed off, played it off like it was all jokes, even asked if Leandra was Twin's girl. Twin corrected him and told him that was his sister. For a second, it felt like it was over. Another neighbor even added that he didn't want drugs sold in front of his place either. But Twin wasn't built for beef. He didn't like bad energy lingering. He stayed and talked with the kid for a minute, found out he grew up just a few blocks away. They ended up shaking hands. Twin even told him to come back later and watch the fight, said they'd save him a drink. That should have been the end of it. But later that night, before the fight even started, Twin stepped back outside with Gaudy and Leandra to wait on a pizza delivery. That's when the same skinny kid appeared again. This time he came out of a nearby alley with his hood up. This time he had a gun. Alice was still inside the house. She had never heard a real gunshot before. The first sounds didn't even register as danger. It just sounded like the fireworks someone across the street had been popping earlier. Then she heard her sister scream. At first she thought Leandra was just being dramatic. That was her nature sometimes. But when Alice reached the door and looked outside, everything stopped. Twin was slumped on the front steps, bleeding, not moving. The shooter was gone. Twin had been hit 9 times, chest, arms, neck. The neck shot did the most damage. And because he had alcohol in his system, his blood wouldn't clot right. The doctors couldn't stop the bleeding. He died on the operating table. That part alone was devastating, but what hurt even worse was what came after. Plenty of people had seen what happened. The block had been full, but when the police arrived, nobody said a word. Nobody stepped up. Nobody pointed fingers. Nobody except Alice and Leandra. They told the police exactly who they believed did it. They couldn't understand why everyone else stayed silent. Even Gotti, who had been sitting right there with Twin, didn't talk. They didn't understand yet, but they were about to, because in that neighborhood, that kid wasn't just a kid. That kid was Tana, and Tana had a reputation. After Alfonso Williams was killed, his sisters were still in shock, still barely holding themselves together. But even in that state, they did one thing that mattered. They gave the police a name. That name was Tana. So the cops went and picked him up for questioning. When Tana walked into homicide downtown, he did not look like somebody who had just executed a man on a front stoop. He looked calm, too calm, relaxed, polite, almost friendly. He was wearing a black vest over a sleeveless shirt, sitting loose in the chair, smiling, acting like this was just another regular conversation. Detective Josh Fuller sat across from him and laid the accusation out. Tana reacted like it was all brand new information. He admitted he had been outside that day selling some Percocet. He admitted there had been a little back and forth with Alfonso earlier, but that was it. That was as far as he was willing to go. According to him, he was nowhere near West Lafayette Avenue when the shots were fired. His story was that he was downtown at the Sheraton with a girlfriend, but he said he did not check in under his own name, and he conveniently could not remember the name he used. The girlfriend backed him up, but when the detectives checked, there was nothing. No hotel record, no camera footage, no proof he had ever been there at all. The truth was simple and ugly at the same time. Everybody on that block knew exactly who pulled the trigger, but nobody was talking. The only ones who spoke up were Alfonso's sisters, and even they had a disadvantage. They were new to the neighborhood. They knew the name, but they did not really know the face. Detective Fuller had a list of witnesses a mile long, people who were outside, people who saw the shooting with their own eyes, and every single one of them stayed silent, not because they did not care, but because they were scared. The one person who could break the case open was Gaudy. Gaudy had been sitting right next to Alfonso when it happened. He was not new. He was not a visitor. He grew up on that block. He had known everybody there his whole life. 3 weeks after the murder, Gaudy sat across from Fuller and another detective named Gordon Carew, and he folded. The moment the questions started, his voice started shaking. His throat tightened up. He kept saying he did not see anything, kept saying he had walked away before the shots. The detectives knew better. They pushed him gently at first, then a little harder. They told him people were saying he was right there. They told him they knew he knew who did it. That is when Gaudy dropped his head onto the table. He buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He said he did not want to get himself or his family involved. He said he knew that if he talked, the same thing would happen to him next. The room went quiet. After a long pause, he finally whispered the name. Tana. They pushed for the real name. Gotti resisted. He played dumb. He pretended not to know, but the wall was already cracked. They asked him what happened. Gotti said the shooter was dark-skinned. He said the boy emptied the whole clip. He said he just kept shooting and shooting while Gotti sat frozen next to Alfonso, unable to move. He said Tana had been around the neighborhood his whole life. Then came the motive. Disrespect. That was it. Alfonso stood up for his sister, and that was enough to get him killed. That is when Detective Danielle Taylor came in with the photo lineup. The second Gotti saw the folders, his anxiety shot through the roof. He started worrying about court, worrying about being labeled a witness, worrying about what this meant for his future. Taylor tried to calm him down. She told him looking at pictures did not automatically mean he had to testify later. She told him at the end of the day, he just had to do what he felt was right. Gotti slowly flipped through the photos, one by one, until he stopped. He pointed at the fifth photo. The name on it was Montana Baronet. That was Tana. Taylor slid the photo back in front of him and asked what connection that person had to the shooting. Gotti did not hesitate this time. He said that was the one who shot Twin. As soon as he said it, the weight of it hit him. He dropped his head again. He groaned. He sat there for a long time just trying to breathe through what he had done. Then the fear rushed back in. He started panicking about retaliation, about his life, about his family, about whether he had just signed his own death warrant. He kept asking himself what he was doing. Then he said something else. He said, God put him there. Taylor met him in that moment and told him to do what God wanted him to do. So he wrote it. 4 words under the photo. He shot Twin. His hand was shaking while he wrote it. He kept muttering that he could not believe he was really doing this. Then Taylor asked for his signature. That was the breaking point. Gotti got angry with himself, slammed the pen on the table, stared at the paper like it was a snake, but in the end, he signed it. As Taylor left the room, Gotti panicked all over again. He shouted after her that he could not testify, that he could not get on the stand, that he was not ready to put his life and his family's life on the line like that. Then the door closed and he was alone. Alfonso Williams was not the first person connected to Train to Go who had been killed, but his death changed everything because it was the first time Tana had ever been officially named as a murderer. Now, once the bodies started stacking up and the name TTG kept coming back around, 3 detectives decided this wasn't just another case. This was personal. They locked in on Tana and made it their mission to take him off the streets for good. This wasn't a fast bust. This was a slow hunt. They planted informants. They set up controlled buys. They followed the money, the phones, the people. Then they started listening. In February 2016, investigators got permission to track a phone tied to civils. A month later, they were inside the calls. By April, they were tapped into a second phone too. And once those lines were open, everything spilled. The crew talked too much. They talked about drugs, about money, about who owed what, about who needed to be handled. At the same time, officers on the ground were watching the hand-to-hands, watching the stash moves, watching the patterns. By summer, the picture was clear. In August, search warrants went out. Doors got kicked. Stash houses got emptied. And on August 22nd, 2016, police finally grabbed Tana, already labeled the most dangerous man in the city, already tied to multiple murders. The streets had called him the top trigger puller for years. Now the system was saying it too. The charges were heavy: murder, conspiracy, assault, gun crimes, reckless endangerment, a whole stack of paper with his name on every page. The police made it clear they weren't done either. They believed he was tied to up to a dozen killings across Baltimore, and they were hoping that with him locked up, people would finally feel safe enough to talk. For a moment, it felt like the storm had passed. Then the city made a mistake. In January 2017, Tana walked out of central booking. Not because a judge cleared him, not because a jury freed him, because of paperwork. The state dropped his charges to let the feds take over, but the booking center didn't know about the federal hold. So at 3 a.m, Baltimore's most wanted man was released into the dark. The city froze. People panicked. Leaders spoke out, because this wasn't just any error. This was the wrong man at the wrong time in the worst possible way. For 36 hours, nobody knew where he was. Then federal agents found him about 20 miles away and put him back in cuffs. 2 workers were suspended. Apologies were issued. Promises were made, but the damage was done. Finally, in June 2017, the hammer dropped. A grand jury handed down a massive indictment against Tana, Rel, and the rest of TTG. Racketeering, drug conspiracy, murder, kidnapping, robbery, witness intimidation, a full list of everything the streets had whispered about for years. The Fed said TTG wasn't just selling drugs. They were running a violent enterprise, killing to protect territory, killing to silence people, killing to stay on top. Some of the charges carried mandatory life. Some even carried the possibility of death. In 2018, the case got even bigger. Another indictment came down, locking every defendant into the same conspiracy, same story, same pattern, same violence. The trial started in September, and the tension followed it inside the courtroom. Fights broke out, marshals got assaulted, weapons were found. The gang's name got carved into furniture. Witnesses were scared. 2 people connected to the case were already dead. The court had to limit who could even sit inside because the streets had followed the case through the front door. After nearly a month of testimony, the jury came back with guilty across the board. They found Tana guilty of plotting multiple murders. They found the others guilty of moving massive amounts of drugs and using violence to protect it. They confirmed what the city had already lived through, that TTG had turned parts of Baltimore into a war zone. When it was over, the message was simple. The crew that once thought they were untouchable was finished. By February 15, 2019, the run was over. At just 23 years old, Montana Baronet stood in a Baltimore courtroom and got hit with 2 life sentences. No parole, no light at the end. Between that and the extra fines, the message was clear. He wasn't coming home. It took a long road to get there. Months earlier, a jury had spent an entire week debating before finding him and 7 others from the Train to Go crew guilty of racketeering and drug conspiracy. Every one of them was now staring at the same future. The courtroom that day was heavy. His lawyer tried to flip the story, saying Montana wasn't just a criminal. He was a product, born into the streets, raised in violence, failed by the system before he ever had a real chance. The defense begged for 60 years instead of life, arguing that he started hustling at 13 and grew up in a city where murder felt normal. The judge listened. She acknowledged the tragedy on every side, but she didn't bend. She said there had already been too much blood, too much damage, too many families torn apart. And even if Montana might someday understand what he'd done, he wasn't there yet. So she gave him life twice. Prosecutors said he was responsible for 6 murders. One person causing that much pain in one city was more than enough, they said. Taking him off the streets wasn't just justice, it was relief. The case itself had been a full-scale operation. Local detectives, federal agents, task forces, analysts, all working together. This wasn't luck. This was pressure applied from every angle. Even the police leadership showed up in person. They wanted young kids watching to see how this story really ends. Not with money, not with respect, but with chains and concrete walls. The prosecutors didn't sugarcoat anything. They called him cold. They called him ruthless. But what said the most was the silence in the room. Only one family member spoke, not because the others didn't care, but because they were scared. One mother wasn't. She stood up for her son. She told the court about the day he was killed outside his grandmother's house, about getting the call, about running down the street, about broken glass and police tape and hospital hallways that felt like tunnels with no end, about the moment a doctor told her her son's heart had stopped. She told them how every week, no matter the weather, she goes to his grave and wipes the dirt off his name. How the hardest part isn't going, it's leaving. She told the court that no one should ever have the power to do that to another family, and that she was grateful he never would again. Montana apologized, not cleanly, not fully, but he tried. His sister spoke too. She stood by him, said they didn't have parents, said they raised each other, said the streets were all they knew, and that part was true. Baltimore is packed with gangs, hundreds of them. In places like Sandtown, the game isn't entertainment, it's survival. When death becomes normal, life starts feeling cheap. When the world ignores you long enough, recklessness starts to feel logical. That was his reality. He felt forgotten, discarded, unprotected. So he stopped caring what happened to him. And when your own life feels worthless, everybody else's life starts feeling light too. That's how he lived, and that's how he ended up right where he did, behind a door that won't open again.